Graham Gooch's specialist subject is West Indian pace bowling. He is probably the leading authority on what it was like to face the four horsemen of the apocalypse. From 1980 to 1995, when the West Indies dominated Test cricket, nobody scored more runs against them than Gooch, and only Alan Border faced more deliveries. Gooch also played the greatest innings of all time, 154 not out at Headingley in 1991. It is worth listening, then, when he says that only once in his career did he feel unsafe. Friday the 21st of February 1986 at Sabina Park, the first day of a much-anticipated series, and the start of a weekend festival of chin music. England had a bespoke batting lineup full of men who didn't understand the concept of pain, yet they were still brutalized inside 3 days. It was horrible. They had to contend with a corrugated pitch, a low sight screen, an umpire with a laissez-faire attitude towards bouncers, and the volcanic pace of the debutant Patrick Patterson. It was the first time, said Gooch, it ever really got the whiff of danger in the nostrils. That smell wafted around the ground, all the way to the press box. The Times' John Woodcock wrote that he thought somebody might be killed. Wisden Cricket Monthly said it was cricket's equivalent to the Somme. The match was not televised because of a financial dispute between the BBC and the West Indies Cricket Board. You won't find it on YouTube, you can buy it on a dodgy NTSC DVD from some bloke in Canada. It's the last England Test match of which there is no footage. That's both a shame, because we'll never see it, and a blessing, because we'll never see it. It could never be as vivid or as terrifying as it is in the imagination. The lack of footage makes it an almost mythical nightmare. The most remarkable crap. 5 months earlier, it was the West Indies who were quaking in the boots. That was David Gower's flippant comment on the Oval balcony after his England side regained the Ashes with consecutive innings victories. The 31 defeat of Australia followed a fine 21 win in India, and for many jumping to conclusions became irresistible. The trip to the Caribbean would decide which was the best team in the world. Even the experts thought England had an outside chance. At the start of the tour, The Guardian cricket correspondent Matthew Engel reflected the mood when he said 21 to the West Indies might be a reasonable guesstimate. It was only 18 months since the West Indies had won 50 in England, but the common perception was that they had aged and England had matured. The argument for England said they had the best batting lineup in the world. In 1985, they averaged a whopping 52 runs per wicket, miles clear of everyone else, and the best spin bowling attack too. 2 tests were to be played at Trinidad, which usually took spin. They had also picked 3 fast bowling specialists, the batsmen David Smith and Peter Willey, 2 men who dark alleys were afraid to have walked down them, and the Glamorgan bowler Greg Thomas, often described as the fastest white bowler in the world. They had a solid seam attacker, Ian Botham, who had bowled faster than ever during the Ashes, was overdue against the West Indies. By contrast, the Windies had an inexperienced captain in Viv Richards, and an aging team with 6 regulars in the 30s. In 1985, they had even lost a test match. The main concern at the start of the tour was that England's warm-up schedule, 3 first-class matches and an ODI before the first test, would not be enough preparation. It turned out to be quite enough, thank you. In that time, morale, optimism and Mike Gatting's nose all suffered enormous external and internal damage. A 3-day pounding in the first test at Sabina Park finished England off. It was the first time in history a team went 50 down after 1 test. England's pre-series problems ranged from dreadful net facilities to politics, with 4 of the squad having been on the rebel tour of South Africa 4 years earlier. It was a particularly difficult time for Gower. His mother died just before the team flew out, a bereavement that was even tougher than usual for an only child whose father had died when he was younger, and whose long-term relationship was starting to break down. He and Botham, who had completed his first 1,000-mile charity walk at the end of 1985, were arrested from the opening match and were on a yacht supping beers while England were being spun out for 94 by the Windward Islands, the only team in the Shell Shield with no West Indian cricketers. England lost by 7 wickets, and there were many pious editorials about Gower's absence, some of them from people who regularly got pissed on the job, never mind off it. David Gower and Ian Botham recreate Duran Duran's Rio video. David Smith has some downtime after doing battle with the West Indies quicks, and Phil Edmonds shows off his war wounds after the first test. Photographs Getty Images Patrick Eager via Getty Images. Much of the media coverage had a freestyle approach to empathy and honesty. This was the height of the tabloid war, and as the tour went on, Botham became so paranoid that he hardly left his hotel room in the evening. Allegations ranged from the England players leaving broken glass on a hotel tennis court to Botham and Lindy Field, a former Miss Barbados, and unproven accusations of breaking a bed during a night of sex and snort. When Gower sat down for a press conference before the one-day series, he was asked matter-of-factly whether his poor personal form was due to his affair with Paul Downton's wife. Downton was England's third-choice wicketkeeper, so it would have been some story were it true. The evidence of Gower's affair was a picture of him kissing Mrs. Downton on the cheek at her wedding. There was one bloke in particular, a freelance hitman, sending back the most remarkable crap, said Gower in his autobiography. The sports writers, alas, had to send back a couple of stories of the most remarkable crap too. After that embarrassing defeat to the Windward Islands, England got another touch of the nervous 94s in the next game. They played superbly for 3.5 days against the Leeward Islands, then made a desperate mess of chasing 116 to win. They finished on 94 for 8 with Sir Richie Richardson, the great West Indies number 3 batsman, taking 5 for 40. He had never taken a first-class wicket in his life. And set to Jamaica, where England faced 3 games in a fortnight. The first, a tour match, was won impressively by 158 runs, though Gower's poor form continued after a comprehensive working over from Courtney Walsh, during which he was hit on the hand, helmet and forearm. Walsh couldn't even get in the West Indies squad for the first test. Patterson, picked ahead of him, was omitted from the tour match so that England would not get a look at him. They didn't get much sight of him when he did play. The low sight screen in front of the George Headley stand made it difficult to see the ball properly when it was released by anybody over 6 foot. After problems in the tour match, England requested that it be raised for the upcoming Odeon test. They were told this would not be possible, as it would impair the view of a few hundred spectators who had already bought tickets. It was a comforting thought, humming Hail Marys to yourself as Patterson's arm whirled over from a point comfortably off the radar, that someone had a good view, said Gower later. Patterson was selected for the first ODI a few days later. He had been in deadly form during the Shell Shield season, splattering Guyana for 41 on the opening day of the season with figures of 7 for 24. In the next game he and Walsh routed the Leeward Islands, whose team included Richardson and Richards, for 77. Patterson also left the Leewards opener Luther Kelly a little dentally challenged when a bouncer took out 2 front teeth. England struggled to reconcile the scare stories with the Patterson they knew. Most of them had played against him the previous summer when he was at Lancashire. He was sharp and raw, but so were tens of other West Indian fast bowlers waiting for a chance in international cricket. Patterson had an upset stomach on his ODI debut, yet bowled with good pace to dismiss Tim Robinson and Gower for 4 ball ducks. Marshall, the world's best bowler, came on second change. It felt like a sick joke to demonstrate the depth of the West Indies' fast bowling resources. Gatting, who had been England's best batsman in the warm-up games, tried to hook a ball that skidded off the grassy pitch and squashed his nose. Like most of the England batsmen, he preferred a lighter, clearer helmet with no protective visor or bars. Gatting's hideous injury produced some famous photographs. He looked like a panda, says Smith, who would make his test debut a few days later because of Gatting's injury. There are times when you can't think of anything to say. I remember walking into the physio's room, where he was sitting on the bench, and I said, "Are you alright, Gat?" It was pretty obvious, with 2 black eyes and a hole in his nose, that he wasn't alright. When Marshall prepared to bowl the next delivery, he found a piece of Gatting's nose in the ball and threw it down in disgust. After a few days of waiting for the swelling to subside, during which he suffered severe breathing difficulties, Gatting returned to England for surgery. His replacement was the Middlesex opener Wilf Slack. England had gone to the Caribbean with no backup opener, which was like going to Mars without a spare oxygen tank. There was even talk that Geoffrey Boycott, at the age of 45, would take Gatting's place. When Gatting arrived at Heathrow, he was asked by a journalist where exactly the ball had hit him. The optimism of summer has evaporated, wrote Engel on the eve of the first test, to be replaced by awe at the West Indians' continuing fast bowling strength and apprehension about the way they will use it. England, decent outsiders when they flew out a month earlier, were now 161 to win the first test. England's preparation was so thorough that even Botham, who was allergic to nets, had 2 long sessions with a futuristic new bowling machine called Fred. It looked, wrote Engel, like a cartoon Martian. The match was not televised, but the BBC loathed to pay a reported £300,000 to cover the tour. They and ITN objected so strongly to being asked to pay £500 a day for highlights during the news bulletins that they issued a joint statement criticising the practice of charging for news feeds. A deal was agreed for the remainder of the tour, with the BBC showing highlights on Sports Night and Grandstand. This film gives a flavour of what England's batsmen had to face, though none of it is from Sabina Park. The BBC chose to broadcast only the morning session of each day's play on Radio 3, deciding that the prime-time audience would prefer classical music to chim music. Presumably, said one letter to The Guardian, the eager sporting listener can look forward to such future treats as the opening half-hour of the World Cup final, lap 1 of the Olympic 1,500 metres final, and the first 5 rounds of Barry McGuigan's next title defence. Father's corrections. England made a perfect start to the series. It lasted 55 minutes. Gooch and Robinson, who had made a spectacular start to his Test career, batted with calm authority against Marshall and Joel Garner. It was quiet, too damn quiet. Then Patterson replaced Marshall at the dodgy sight screen end, and there was instant mayhem. Robinson was caught at slip, fending off a homing missile that cut sharply off the pitch towards his face, and Gower was given the hurry out by Patterson to such an extent that he slashed his second and third deliveries for 4 and 6 over third man. He soon went to Michael Holding for an eccentric 10-ball 16. The England dressing room fast realised that this was not the Patterson they knew from Lancashire. He was a shock, said Botham in his autobiography Don't Tell Kath. He was murderously quick and so raw, so full of hatred, like Holland Croft and Sylvester Clarke used to be. I expect HES a lovely bloke off the field. Gower confirmed as much. He was, as with so many of those West Indian quicks, a very nice guy, he wrote in An Endangered Species. He called me D. Patterson's ungainly style made him even more intimidating. He was all muscle and bustle, with none of Holding's elegance and little of Marshall's craft. He could, however, bowl faster than the lot of them. He had a powerful action rather than an easy, lithe one, says Thomas. He was a bit wild, but, bloody hell, he did bowl quickly. As a batsman and umpire, Willie has seen all the great fast bowlers of the last 40 years. None left an impression quite like Patterson. If people are bowling 90 miles an hour now, he says, Patterson must have been bowling 100 miles per hour in the game. Anyone familiar with Willie will know this is certainly not in my deism. Patterson was gap-toothed and bow-legged, with a cruiserweight's frame and a few distinctive features: enormous thighs on top of matchstick legs, and shot putter shoulders that gave him devastating power and speed. Patrick, wrote the author Frances Edmonds, wife of the England spinner Phil, has muscles in places where other men simply do not have places. His bowling action was a statement of the most malevolent intent. He thrust his left foot towards the batsman, spikes showing, his legs so high as to provide a rigorous test of the fabric in his trousers. Then, the foot would slam down, hard enough to measure on the Richter scale in Mike Selby's words, and his body would propel forward to batter the ball into the pitch. Cricinfo's Andrew Miller memorably described it as a stiff-limbed, stud-slamming action like a windmill being ripped off its axis in a hurricane. Patterson got the ball to lift viciously off a hard, ridged pitch that started uneven and got worse. It looked like an ironic haircut, bald for the most part, with rogue tufts here and there and a big green patch in the middle, also known, in this match, as a good length. It's one of the worst wickets I've played on against bowlers of that caliber, says Willie, whose rumbustious second innings 71 was the highest score of the match. It was German 88mm against air pistols. We were just blasted out of it. We didn't mind the bounces, that's the way cricket was. They could bowl you 4 or 5 bounces and over, and it wasn't a bother, you learned how to play them. The trouble was the uneven bounce. If somebody's bowls two balls in the same spot at that pace, and one goes past your neck and one goes past your ankles, you're knackered. A batsman's view of Patrick Patterson, taken from the second test in Trinidad. Photograph Patrick Eager via Getty Images. It made for arguably the scariest match England have ever played. The Bodyline series of 193,233 was played on truer pitches, and although the abandoned test of 199,798 was played on another diabolical surface at Sabina Park, at least it didn't go the distance. And Richardson, who was at both games, reckoned the 1986 pitch was worse. There was no chance of it being abandoned. No, that was never discussed, says Thomas. You just played and that was it. It was the kind of thing you accepted, even if you were a tailender. It was a tough job. These were different times for masculinity, when most batsmen would rather lose the features than lose face. In 1986 there was no limit on the number of bounces that could be bowled. It was left to the umpires to judge whether, in accordance with Law 42, the bowling was deliberately intimidatory. The batsman got some protection from one umpire, David Archer. But Johnny Gale, who was at Patterson's end, saw nothing wrong. England adopted a sod this for a lark approach to batting. Even though they were skittled twice, they scored the runs at 3.52 runs per over, the fastest against West Indies since 1939. The old bad wicket mantra, get as many as you can before the pitch gets you, had a darker implication. For the first and, I think, only time, I began saying to myself, Greg, it might be doing yourself a favor if you got out, wrote Gooch in his autobiography. This boy Patterson is really firing and it could get very nasty indeed. If you don't watch it, you could be hit very badly. Graham Gooch avoids a bouncer during his superb first innings 51. Photograph Patrick Eager via Getty Images. Alan Lamb's mortality awareness levels were also going through the roof. When he started to counter-attack successfully, Richards told Marshall to give him a serious delivery. Lamb inquired what that meant. Richards smiled. It's one that you eat, Lambie. It wasn't even lunchtime on the first day. Lamb spanked 49 from 67 balls before being bowled by an unplayable grubber from Ghana. I've usually managed to find a bit of fun in cricket, whatever the state of the game, but not that morning in Kingston, he said in his autobiography. I'm not saying I was keen to get out, but I fancied a change of scenery because it struck me that life can, on occasions, be more important than a cricket match. England were bowled out for 159 in 45.3 overs, with Patterson taking 4 for 30. Gooch top scored with 51 before being caught off the splice from an unplayable Marshall lifter. It's impossible to overstate how good Marshall was, and in 1986 he was in the middle of a 5-year spell when he took 235 test wickets at an average of 18.47. Thomas, batting at number 11, even though he had a first-class century, was needed by mid-afternoon. During the innings I was talking to Bob Willis, who was the tour manager, he says. He'd been on a British college's trip to West Indies a couple of years earlier, and, as there wasn't that much media attention on the game, I said to him, to be honest Bob, this doesn't feel like a bloody test match. It feels like being on tour with the lads. The game went on and I went in to bat. There was only one man in front of the wicket, at short square leg. I looked round, and Jeff Doohan and the slips were miles back. Then Garner ran in to bowl. I don't remember seeing the ball. I heard it clatter. This was my first ball, and the leg stump almost reached Doohan. I walked back to the changing room and was taking my pads off when Bob tapped me on the shoulder. He said, does it feel like a test match now? The longer the tour went on, the more England would need gallows humour. Joel Garner bowls a bouncer to Phil Edmonds, while the slip cordon looks on from a different postcode. Photograph Patrick Eager via Getty Images. Marshall, Holding and Garner were 3 all-time greats, yet it was Patterson who stood out. If anyone has ever bowled quicker than that, well, said Gooch. He was rapid, and I mean really rapid. That view is supported by Doohan, the wicketkeeper who was chief witness to the West Indies' reign of terror. He kept to all the greats from 1981 to 1991, and did so with such feline excellence that 95 miles per hour deliveries became much of a muchness. Every time he is interviewed, he patiently answers the inevitable question. who was the fastest to onside 2 spells, both by Patterson's Sabina Park 1986 and the last day of the Boxing Day test in 1988, when Australia unwisely provoked him and he threatened to kill them all the next day. He settled for the compromise of a match winning 5-4. In the first over of that spell, Duhon took a short delivery and heard a scrunch. A split second later, the pain of a broken finger reached his brain. The strange thing about Sabina Park is that the only person who retired hurt was a West Indian batsman. Late on the first day, Gordon Greenidge hooked both them into his own face and needed 3 stitches. West Indies finished the day on 85 for naught, though the particular score flattered them. Thomas could have dismissed Desmond Haynes with his first 2 balls in Test cricket. The first flew off the edge between first and second slip, the second was put down by Will in the gully. He completed a spectacular over by ripping one straight past Haynes' face. In Thomas' next over, Greenidge gave him what Garner called a father's correction, bashing 3 fours. Thomas' performance in the match led Christopher Martin Jenkins to write in The Cricketer that he is the real thing at last, and though his series figures of 8 wickets at 46 were modest, the sheer heat and quality of his bowling had most predicting that England's hunt for a truly fast bowler was over, including the greatest of them all. "I could see that here was an outstanding young talent," said Marshall in his autobiography, Martial Arts. "He earned the respect of all our batsmen." This being the 1980s, he played only one more test in his career. Thomas only realized he had earned the opposition's respect when, as the series progressed, they started to administer a few more father's corrections. Being targeted by the West Indies batsman was a strange kind of compliment. The Glamorgan fast bowler Greg Thomas in action during the second test in Trinidad. Photograph Patrick Eager via Getty Images. Thomas and particularly Botham hit the green bit of the pitch with similar frequency to the West Indies bowlers. There were overs in which Botham bowled 6 attempted bounces, wrote Woodcock in the Times. All that did was stir up further trouble for England's batsmen, especially with umpires who pay not the slightest attention to the law as it relates to short-pitch bowling. One man's bouncer is another man's shortish delivery. "I don't remember anyone bowling many bounces," says Thomas. "It was more back-of-the-length stuff on both sides. You didn't need to bowl bounces on that wicket, it was flying." One short ball from Botham was hooked for 6 by the debutant Carlisle Best, his first scoring stroke in Test cricket. Best famously commentated on his own innings, "You can't bowl there to Carlisle Best," and doubtless had plenty to say as he launched beefy into the crowd. Amid the virility, Richard Ellison's crafty swing bowling yielded a third 5-4 in as many tests. This being the 1980s, he played only 3 more tests in his career. Ellison concentrated on a different part of the body. 4 of his wickets were LBW, part of a then record equaling 6 in the innings. West Indies were dismissed for 307, a lead of 148. There was also a row between Greenidge and Edmonds, who was standing intrusively close at short leg. It was an unusual occurrence in the series, despite the punishing nature of the cricket. Most were already friends from county cricket. "We all got on exceptionally well, it was excellent that way," says Thomas. There was no animosity, nothing whatsoever. Both teams knew that it was nothing personal, just business, and that West Indies had an unchallengeable monopoly. "I felt as if my chest had caved in on the 3rd morning." Before play, Robinson practiced with the bowling machine, Fred, on a concrete wicket. Fred could do almost anything. He could give you a 94 miles per hour bouncer or a 66 miles per hour in-swinger. What he couldn't replicate was a length delivery from the 6 feet 8 inch Garner that would shoot along the floor. Robinson was bowled for a duck, and Gooch followed for naught in the next over from Marshall. Robinson went to the West Indies, averaging 62 per innings, thinking Test cricket was a piece of piss. He barely made that many in the series, 72 runs, an average of 9, and his Test career never truly recovered. Tim Robinson, who averaged 62 going into the tour, had a desperate time. Here his is bowled by Patrick Patterson in the 3rd Test in Barbados. Photograph Adrian Murrell Sport Getty Images. Soon it was time for Patterson's second crack at England, a 6 of a spell of unprecedented menace. There are no greater compliments from no greater authorities than those he received for his speed in the second innings. In the Times, Woodcock deemed it on a par with Frank Tyson in the 195,455, one or two of his short ones being just about as fast as man can bowl, while Wisden said his pace was comparable to that of Jeff Thomson of Australia in his prime. One delivery cleared everyone and bounced just inside the boundary. Gower was caught at third man, placed there deliberately as a catcher 2 balls earlier. It was his 7th failure out of 7 on the tour. His scores were 5, 9, 2, 11, 0, 16, 9. Lamb then received what Engel described as the most extraordinary cannonade of bounces. His innings had more incident than most 7-hour centuries. He was at the crease for 15 balls. Lamb was hit on the helmet and the body, slapped 3 boundaries and was caught top-edging a hook. He was one of 3 men out-hooking in the innings. Botham, who had fallen that way in the first innings, landed a few haymakers in a 28-ball 29 that included 2 hooked sixes, 1 top-edged off Patterson, 1 off the meat from the first ball of Marshall's spell. Marshall went straight around the wicket and bowled 4 more consecutive bounces, 2 of which Botham walloped for 4 to make it 14 from the over. Marshall was stirred first by the unspoken speed contest with Patterson and then by Botham's chutzpah. In Marshall's next over, Botham was bowled while hooking, another victim of the uneven bounce. It was the start of another difficult tour, particularly with the bat. He averaged 16.8 with a top score of 38. The West Indies were the one team Botham could never conquer. Willie was almost the opposite, a West Indies specialist who played 15 of his 26 tests against them, facing the bowlers head-on with his extraordinary open stance. When he went out to bat in the second innings in Jamaica, having been pushed up from number 7 to number 4, Willie was not exactly high on life. "I had a bit of a humour on," he says. "It was horrible. One ball was going past your throat, one was going past your ankles. So I decided to have a swing at anything that was in the slot." He crashed 71 from 104 balls, including 9 fours and a 6 off Patterson. When he reached his half-century, the press box tossed impartiality out the window and stood to applaud. Willie does not recall the low sight screen of Patterson's studs-up action. I didn't see the foot and I didn't care what was going on behind him, he says. "You're just looking for that thing coming down at you." He was in a higher state of concentration. Sometimes, it's not you batting. You're in the zone. You don't think about what you're going to do, it just happens. There's no time to think. You never thought about getting hit. It never entered your head, not even on a day like that. I put the grill on in the first innings and I got out for naught. I couldn't see the ball. The second innings I put the side flaps on and just watched the ball. It's like a boxer, you watch the fist. If you watch the ball 99.9% of the time, you'll find a way to get your head out of the way. Doesn't matter if it hits you anywhere else. When he was dismissed, Willie walked back to the dressing room and was greeted by Thomas. "Are you okay?" "Yeah, fine." "Why, you look about 150. Thomas remembers it well. He looked like death. Honestly, he was gaunt and pale. And he's a bloody tough character. Peter Willie faces the West Indian bowlers head-on. Photograph Patrick Eager via Getty Images. The same was true of Smith. He was picked because of his ability against fast bowling, but his debut was not a good one. He made 1 in the first innings and 0 in the second, when he batted at number 7 because of sunstroke and was caught on the boundary hooking Marshall. "I don't think I've ever seen anybody so angry in the changing rooms," laughs Thomas. He was absolutely fuming because Marshall bounced him out, and he threw his helmet on the floor. "I never thought a helmet could break into so many pieces." Nobody went anywhere near him for quite some time. Honestly, he was in a foul mood. It was quite frightening. When he was recalled for the 4th test in Trinidad, Smith top-scored in both innings with 47 and 32. This being the 80s, well, you know the rest. He missed the last match through injury and didn't play another test. "It gives me a lot of pride to have top-scored in both innings," he says. "Talking about it makes me go cold because it's the most exciting thing you can ever do on a cricket field." The thrill was in the challenge, knowing that it was the pinnacle, that you couldn't go any higher. Not just in 1986, but ever. Test batting will certainly never be as tough again. I was never scared. That never came into it. You know you'll get hit, but you wipe that out of your head. To me it was a battle. It was like walking around in certain parts of London. I won't start anything, but if somebody wants to have a row." Smith had been picked at the age of 30 after a barnstorming performance against an otherwise rampant Marshall in the county championship the previous summer. In Trinidad, he took on the West Indies to such an extent that his partner Lamb kept trying to shut him up for fear of reprisals. "Pattison hit me and he was standing next to me," says Smith. "I told him to F off. Leave me alone, they're trying to kill you anyway, so whatever. You can't wind them up anymore. I'm not a thug, but I would take people on." Viv was having a few words with me, so I pointed my bat at him and said, "If you want it as well, you can have it." I would NT back down. It was just part of the battle. I had a huge amount of respect for the West Indian players. It was awesome to play against them. The Jamaican crowd lapped up the success of the local boy Patrick Pattison. Photograph Frank Barron for The Guardian. With the match approaching its conclusion, Edmonds was hit over the heart by an accidental beamer from Pattison. "I felt," he said, "as if my chest had caved in. And that was with the kind of chest protector used by jockeys to protect them from a horse's kick." As he staggered around like a confused zombie, Edmonds dislodged the bails, and should technically have been given out. Both umpires left the decision to the other, and he was given another life. In Another Bloody Tour, her famous book of the tour, Edmonds' wife Frances read, "There is a protective bodice, a lot of very thick skin, quite a bit of excess adipose tissue, and a wodge of checkbooks to penetrate before anyone gets anywhere near Phil Edmonds' heart." The next ball was short, straight into the hip. "The longer the match went on, the less like a civilized game of cricket it became," wrote Woodcock. Except on that evening of ill fame at Old Trafford in 1976, when Close and John Edridge were subjected to such a disgraceful barrage by the West Indian fast bowlers, I think I have never felt it more likely that we should see someone killed. Edmonds was soon the last man to fall, to give Pattison his 7th wicket of the match. "I would NT say it was shit batting, we just got bowled out," says Willie. When you talk to some modern cricketers about the West Indies, they say, they weren't that quick. I'd like to see them face Pattison on those wickets. West Indies needed 5 runs to complete a 10-wicket victory. England lasted 88.2 overs in the match, not eye-catching these days, but almost without precedent in 1986. It was 79 years since they had been bowled out so quickly in both innings of a test. "Perhaps no team in history would have coped any better," wrote Engel. "I can't recall a test when it was so impossible to foresee any result other than a win for one side." There are photos of Edmonds on a beach a few days later, with a grotesque crater just below his left nipple. The mental bruising took even longer to subside. In most mismatches there is a quick finish, a knockout blow, or a couple of hours of misery. England had to stand there and take it for the best part of 3 months. They were getting it from their own, too, with increasingly vituperative criticism of everything from the decision to make some net sessions optional to the inability to repel the greatest bowling attack in history. "It has been very easy to abuse England on this trip," wrote Engel. "1 or 2 people in the press box have sounded a bit like Lord Haig, demanding from the Compt HQ that soldiers hurl themselves against the enemy guns." After Jamaica, England looked like a team with a touch of PTSD. "The team talks got shorter and shorter," laughs Thomas. "There was nothing much to talk about. A 50 defeat was inevitable, and confirmed at Antigua after Richards blasted an astonishing 56-ball century. After the first test, the bounces were never overdone," said Engel. "There was no need, the batsmen had seen enough. It was still the toughest assignment in cricket history, especially as at least 3 of the pitches were dodgy, and England exceeded 200 only twice in 10 innings. There was only 100 on the entire tour, Gooch's epic to win the second ODI. In the 4th test at spin-friendly Trinidad, the West Indies included the off-spinner Roger Harper. He didn't bowl a single ball. This was the end of the West Indies' most dominant period, one last series when they postponed the slow, decade-long transition that began when the core of the greatest team started to go over the hill. They drew the next 4 series, 3 of them away from home, and although they stuffed England 40 in 1988, they had gone from the greatest to merely great. The 198,586 series was the conclusion of a 4-year spell in which they won 7 series in a row and had a record of 23 wins and 1 defeat. And the defeat was in a dead rubber. Life goes on the first morning of the second test in Trinidad. Patterson's first 6 overs went for 54 as Gower and Lamb launched a breathless counter-attack. Scorecard aficionados will love England's first innings. There were 10 no-balls in that, a recurring problem in his career and an indication of how he could struggle if his rhythm was not right. He did not have a classical action to fall back on. The locals said he was never the same away from Sabina Park, too, and eventually he ended his career with 93 wickets at 30.90 from 28 tests. He did produce some more chilling spells, particularly overseas. There was the day in Melbourne, and in 198,788 he took 5 fours in consecutive tests in India. The dashing opener Chris Srikanth recalled one evening in Kolkata. "I knew if I got hit by any of his deliveries, I could die on the spot," he said in 2009. "He walked down the pitch and gave me cold stares and I felt the chill running down the spine. I survived only because of my reflexes." Patterson's international career ended at the age of 31 when he was sent home from a tour of Australia for disciplinary reasons. He became a paranoid recluse, prompting wild speculation about what had happened to him. Some said he was a destitute drug addict, others that he was in an asylum. He was found last month by the Indian journalist Bharat Sundarsan, the culmination of a 6-year search. The result was one of the more poignant features of the year. No complaints in England. There was a significant moral panic over the nature of the West Indies' domination. The West Indies and the other members of the ICC ought to be asking themselves if this is really what they want cricket to be, wrote Engel. Suggestions ranged from a longer pitch, a no-ball line halfway down the pitch and a ball made of rubber. The Wisden Cricket Monthly editor David Frith, lamenting a curse both on the spirit of the game and as a spectacle, suggested an amendment to Law 42, which eventually happened in 1991. For richer and poorer, cricket was never the same again. The only people not complaining about the West Indies' tactics were the England players. They were aggrieved about uneven bounce, not bounces. You can easily become a bit shell-shocked, and there were some quiet times in the dressing room, but I don't remember anybody complaining, says Smith. Would I want to play with any other people? No, not at all. There were some tough cookies in the team, and I was proud to be a part of it. England's top scorer in the series, by some distance, was Gower, who recovered from his desperate start to hit scores of 66, 47, 66, 23, 10, 22, 90 and 21 in the last 4 tests. There is more than one way to show character. In context, Gower's 370 runs were as worthy as his 715 against Australia the previous summer. Because he was such a languidly classical batsman, it is often ignored that David was full of guts and immense courage when the fast bowling was at its most dangerous, said Gooch. It was an understated courage, and would laugh it off later in the evening with a typical quip, but I knew, from the other end, how many times I was witness to his fearlessness and genuine bottle. You can't dress up a 50 battering, but you can look at it with fresh eyes. In a world that has become almost too health and safety conscious to function, the level of courage and skill frequently shown by the England batsman 31 years ago is almost beyond comprehension. It remains a grisly old tale, but at least they all live to tell it. Greg Thomas now runs Legato Legal Services. David Smith is the manager of Lashing's All-Stars, whose next match is at Roe Green Cricket Club in Manchester on the 17th of August.